Hello, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video to talk about comfort, to talk about expression, and to talk about behavior. Now, I think it's safe for me to say that these clothes are not the clothes in which I feel most comfortable. And yet I own them. The reason I own them is that I noticed some months ago, almost a year ago, that I had been wearing clothes of, shall we say, a limited palette. If it were to be one of those Crayola packs, there would be very few crayons in that pack of the colors that I would wear. Brown, black, gray, dark blue, forest green, and maybe a little bit of white in between. There are many more colors out there. There are many more styles. And so I thought to myself, I'm going to expand. I'm going to be more than I have been. I'm going to wear something bold and colorful like this. And yet, this is the first time that I have worn this jacket in public. Why? Because every time I have taken it out of my wardrobe, I have sometimes managed to put it on, but sometimes not even managed that before I have said to myself, not today. It doesn't feel right. And I'm a sociologist. As a sociologist, I do research, among other things, on gender. So you'd think that such things would be past me a little bit. That I would be past letting worries about my own comfort in a set of clothes control what I choose to wear. And yet it does. I'll be honest, I don't feel comfortable. I feel self-conscious. I don't feel myself. And what's more, I worry about the reactions of others. What would happen if I needed to stop at a gas station and I was driving in a car in this outfit? What would people say? What would people do? How would people, even if they never said anything, how would they look at me? And what would they think? And for that reason, this is the first time that I've worn this jacket in public. And I don't know when the next time will be. I can hope that it might be sometime soon, but I'm not sure. I don't know what people will think. I don't know if I'm ready. I'm using this discussion in order to bring forth something that a student of mine in the Sociology of Gender course at UMA recently asked. She asked the question, when did it become unacceptable for men to cry as opposed to women crying? When did that happen, and what does that mean? So to answer that question, as a human being, we could tell stories about ourselves, about the people we know, about our local environment. But one of the things we know is that our local environment is disproportionately like ourselves. That's the homophily principle, in effect, that we tend to know people who are like ourselves. And it misses out on a great amount of the diversity of a human experience. So how would, in contrast, a sociologist answer that question? We're going to look at two ways of thinking about crying. One is to take a look at regular records of culture in our society, and one of the holders of culture is books. So we will be using a feature called the Google Ngrams search engine, which looks for words or phrases of words that are next to each other. What can that tell us about the ideas about men and crying? And how can we compare that to ideas of women and crying? The second thing we'll do is we'll look at some published research on men and women and crying, and notice the extent to which this is a regular feature across the world, and notice the extent to which differences between men and women crying vary, actually, in their strength, if not in their direction. Welcome to the Google Ngram search engine. This is a really special feature offered by Google, looking through millions and millions of books that were published between 1800 and 2008 that are in their Google Books database. An Ngram is, it's a phrase. It's a complicated phrase for a word or two words put together or three words put together. The number of words put together is the N, or it's a number. So the neat thing that you could do with this is use essentially the Google search engine to search through the text of books, millions of them over more than 200 years, and you can search for not just one phrase or word, but multiple ones. So in this case, I have asked it to limit to English language books and to search for the phrases women do not cry and men do not cry. And what we see in this pattern is very interesting. Now, to interpret these results, we should know what the axes are. The x-axis, the horizontal axis in this case, refers to a year of publication. And the y-axis refers to a percent share of all phrases in all books that contain the phrases men do not cry in blue or women do not cry in red. So understandably, if you look at the y-axis, the vertical axis, the percentages of all phrases that are these two phrases are low because there are so many phrases that can occur inside a book. But there's an interesting trend that occurs, somewhere between 1940 and 1960, which is that beforehand, when there was a moderate difference between men do not cry and women do not cry, somewhere between 1940 and 1960, depending on whether you take this bump or the larger bump to be more important, we really start to see a widening of this gap. So this notion that women do not cry is remaining at a really low level proportionally, while in the last 70 years or so, the percentage appearance of the phrase men do not cry shoots up in published books. That is a study of culture through printed books. Google Books has millions of them, creating a great record, and not simply a record of the books you have on your shelf. It seems to be some kind of really important change. Now, the question is, what does that reference? Does that reference a shift in gender thinking? Possibly, but it's also possible that it is reflecting, on the one hand, a concern with the idea that men do not cry, and possibly just something that people didn't even think about before 1940. It's additionally possible that the word men refers to something different in the time periods of, say, the 1960s onward compared to the 1960s and beforehand. Namely, that it used to be the case that when one wanted to refer to all people, in a book, in print, one would use the word men to refer to all people, and men was assumed to be the default. That is a very gendered assumption, but that is something that changed after the 60s. It's also an indication of a practice that this is something that men do not do or women do not do. But what about the idea of a cultural value? That is, what should happen. Do we see a similar pattern? Uh, in a way, yes. We do see between the 1940s and the 1960s this takeoff of the idea that men should not cry. What are we missing here? This is a result of an Ngram search in which the phrase women should not cry doesn't come up with enough uh, numbers in order to generate a graph over these years. It doesn't mean that there are no books. It's just that Google won't return a result if the numbers are so low that any trends are not statistically trustworthy. So the fact that we only see a blue line here indicates that this is not simply a description of fact. Men do not cry, women do not cry, but that the idea that men should not cry as a group is really interesting. Now, what about this idea that men could simply, before 1960, have referred to all people? Well, one nice thing about gender is that we have so many words that we could use. One of them might be referring to juveniles, boys and girls. It has never been the case that boys has referred to young people of all genders. So we could do a search for boys do not cry and girls do not cry. And it looks like the idea that this is really a distinction according to a change in how we use the word men in books uh, as opposed to people, which was always available, uh, that's not explaining this difference, right? Um, there's a really huge gap that appears starting from the 40s to the 60s. We could add in the gender neutral people do not cry and see what we get there. That's an additional test. And we don't really see too much difference there, right? So that's not too much change overall. So it's not about people not crying overall. It's about the idea that boys do not cry. What about boys should not cry? Girls should not cry. Well, again, the phrase girls should not cry simply doesn't occur enough to create a trend line, which tells us something, whereas boys should not cry does. And again, you see this increase over the last half century. We could add in people should not cry and again, we don't get enough there, right? This notion that it's in general people who should not cry, uh, or that perhaps children should not cry. Okay, and there's an increase there, but it's nowhere near the increase that in boys should not cry, which is quite interesting as a kind of a phenomenon. So we could continue to look through these and see by adjusting our phrases, like I've been doing, do we get some kind of differences? What about, for instance, I'm just thinking aloud, what about the idea that uh, men could feel sad or that women could feel sad? Well, women feeling sad increases, okay, but there's not enough men feeling sad here in order to um, justify something, justify the creation of a trend line. So the phrase men feel sad is just not occurring uh, enough. What about the general use of the word he uh, felt sad or she felt sad? Do we see a difference there? Interestingly, not so much. Um, in the current period, they're close. So those feelings might be close. Um, how about men get upset and women get upset? We could think about the idea of getting upset and notice a gap in men and women. What about not just general upset, general emotionality associated with general crying, but what about a particular other emotion? Is this true for all emotions? Uh, Men get angry and women get angry. Let's look at that. Well, what we see here is a switch to the pattern that we saw before. Before the 1940s to the 1960s, we see that men almost exclusively were the ones getting angry in books, um, whereas women didn't. And then from the 1960s onward, men getting angry and women getting angry have been at about the same share, which is uh, really an interesting change. So that women and anger become more represented in the culture of books. What other kinds of we could make changes and look at boys getting angry and girls getting angry. We could just keep going and we could look for these uh, kinds of changes, kinds of shifts. Notice boys getting angry again until about the 40s to the 60s. It's almost always boys that are getting angry. And then now girls get angry just about as much as often in the more modern period. This represents a shift in the expression of what is normal for boys and for girls. Try this yourself at books.google.com/ngrams and see what kind of patterns you can find in English language books, of which there are millions and millions published between 1800 and 2008. See what kind of cultural trends you can unpack. So, looking at available data that has previously been collected is an approach called secondary research. And the collection of data about books going back to the year 1800, as Google has reliably done, provides us with a useful way to engage in secondary research regarding crying. However, a number of academics have engaged in primary research, which means that they ask a research question that drives them, and then they go out and they collect their own data. And this is the case regarding the published piece of social science research called Culture and Crying, Prevalences and Gender Differences, completed by an academic team from the Netherlands. It uses data from, appropriately enough, the International Study on Adult Crying. This is a survey that was deployed in 37 countries, if you can believe, to some 5,700 men and women. Slightly more women than men, but large numbers of each. And they wanted to understand why it is that there are differences between men and women in crying. So to do that, they have two measures. One is the tendency to cry, and it's a 10-point scale, and an individual responding to the survey will respond on the low end with a 1, I hardly ever cry, to a 10, I very easily cry. And second is a time since the last crying episode. Was it more than a year ago? That would be a 7, or less than a day ago, a 1. So we're going to focus in the next few slides on the tendency to cry. We could simply plot out these results. And this is taken directly from the crying paper, the reference to which I shared above in the Cross-Cultural Research Journal. Well, this tells us a little bit of something, but it's very busy to look at, right? You'll notice we're trying to stuff all these country names in there, and we're looking at some numerical result. Let's try to make sense of this busyness. First of all, remember that this is a tendency to cry measure. It's a 1 to 10 point scale. And what you see here is a difference for each country between the average result for female respondents minus the average result for male respondents. It's not an absolute value result. It's the signed result. By signed, I mean it could be positive or could be negative. If the female value for tendency to cry is higher than the male value on average for the tendency to cry, then we'll get a positive number. If, however, the average male value is higher than the average female value, you would get a negative number. So what do we see across these 37 countries? Well, we see that there are no negative numbers. In other words, there's no country among any of these 37 in which the males report in this survey on average that they have a greater tendency to cry. The female respondents always, in every country on average, report a greater tendency to cry. That's not the same as every female in the country versus every male in the country. This is the average for each country. But that kind of cultural average is always positive when we're talking about this difference, which means that on average, females cry more than males in these surveys. That is a consistent result, no matter what the nation. On the other hand, the other thing that we're learning from this graph is that the difference is between female respondents and male respondents is highly variable. Take a look at Nigeria, which is most of the way to the right. Excuse me. The difference between the female average and the male respondent average is less than 1, slightly less than 1. Whereas on the other hand, in Switzerland, the difference on this 10-point scale is nearly 4 points, which is a huge difference. The United States, all the nations are organized alphabetically, is on the right-hand side, and it is a little bit more like Switzerland, in fact, a lot more like Switzerland than Nigeria is, or Peru is, or Ghana is. What is it that Nigeria and Peru and Ghana have in common versus, say, Switzerland and the United States, and Finland, and Iceland, and Israel, and the Netherlands? And these countries, what do they have in common? Well, this is not necessarily the best way for us to figure that out. One method would be statistical, but another would be by map. And it turns out that there's a very handy visualization tool called Google Maps that allows you to take just about any spreadsheet data, any tabular data, in which there's some indication of geography in one column and a value, say the difference between the average female and the average male result in another column. And it will give you a plot of those on a world map. So try it out at google.com/maps. But what you see here is a result. And this is a color-coded result where the intensity of the color red indicates the intensity of the differences. Now look at this map. What can you see here? I can see a few things. One of them is that the intensity of colors tend to be clustered close to one another geographically. So Northwestern Europe, There's a concentration of high color, right? On the other hand, take a look at Central Asia. Take a look at the African nations, the 3 African nations that are included. They're close to one another geographically, and also they are close to one another in their relative lack of differences. Also, Southeastern Europe has a cluster of relatively light colors indicating a lack of differences. So it might be that these are regional cultural differences regarding tradition. But one of the other things that we can say about these light colored countries versus the dark colored countries is that the dark colored countries are tending to be, it's not universal, but they're tending to be highly economically prosperous areas, whereas the lighter colored nations are tending to be less prosperous than their neighbors. So, does economics have something to do with this? Is it a regional culture? I don't have the direct answers, but I do note that there is a pattern. Uh, and I also then would conclude walking away from this that we can't simply take our experience in the United States of differences in tendency to cry and assume that universally that same pattern in the same intensity is holding. However, there is something going on that does tend to result in a consistent direction of difference in every one of these countries, no matter what the strength of the difference is, which is variable. There's always a positive difference between uh, female respondents and male respondents in their tendency to cry. Where that comes from is a matter that I encourage you to ruminate on and consider. Why is there not one nation in which men report that they are more likely to cry?